like to ask Beth to come and deliver our reading.
The reading is taken from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there were still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Sorry.
That's okay, thank you. We've got an unfortunate image. I mean, apart from me. Not that one, yeah. Now, many of you, I understand, will be too young to remember this character. So I'll explain briefly, because the media player doesn't like me. This was Frank Spencer, as in Ooh Betty. My sons have discovered the joys of Dad's Army, and some mothers do have them, at which, when we watch an episode of this, we sometimes get the question we may have asked when we were younger ourselves: why is the pretty woman with the silly, foolish man? And Nicholas says, "I just love your father, boys, and this is the way it is." Ended up with him. I don't know. And don't call him a fool when he's in the room, I've told you before. I'm not the only one. There was a few women looking at men going, "Yeah, I don't know why I married him, but I did." Michael Crawford, I don't know if you realise when he did this, or many of you, of course, are too young to remember it, he did all the stunts in this show. And the unfortunate images we have here are of him hurtling down a road on roller skates, narrowly, very narrowly, men, missing that bollard, and catching the moving bus. Now what you can't see is there was a child running along at full pelt. So the bus must have been going about 10, 15 miles an hour. He then goes under an articulated lorry between cars and bursts through a balsa wood door and ends up flipped upside down in a cot. That was the BBC's lead programme. Can you imagine today the lead actor in the flagship programme saying, yeah, I'll do all the stunts myself? It's not going to happen, is it? And sometimes we forget, when we watch his silliness and his story go on, the risks he took for that to be so good, for it to work. Crawford was a risk taker. He made it funny, and some of us who've watched it, the handful of us who are old enough to remember, we can become so overly familiar with it, we forget, yeah, he did all that himself. Those lunatic stunts were performed solo. Level of risk-taking. It was either that clip or I was going to show. Have you watched River Monsters? Yeah. I don't even like fishing. Any fishermen here? Oh, no one's owning up now. I find fishing boring, but if you haven't watched River Monsters, it's not boring. It's risk-taking. How can he get the bull shark to the shore? How many piranha are around his feet? It's fascinating watching. If you haven't watched River Monsters, I would encourage you. It's good programming. The other one I was going to show was Finding Bigfoot. Have you watched that? Finding Bigfoot? That's risk-taking, but on another level. You're risking your sanity because thousands of people seem to genuinely believe that he lives at the bottom of their garden. They've all got southern accents. Nothing against southern accents, but they could be living in Santa Cruz, and suddenly they'll wheel somebody out and they'll say, yeah, he was sitting at the end of my garden eating. What was he eating? He was eating a ham and cheese burrito. Of course he was. He was completely covered in hair, apart from here. Did he run away when you came out? No, he was too big to run, y'all. He just kind of ambled off, had short arms. And I sat there thinking, covered in hair, short arms, too large to run. That's my friend Dave. That's not the Yeti. He's on holiday. Risk-taking. We become so familiar with stories, we forget the elements of risk that were involved. When was the last time we took a risk? The story of Ruth. It seems an ordinary story of everyday folk leading a slightly stressful but everyday life. Short sermon this morning. Normally that would get an amen. I can make it longer. I said it was a short sermon this morning. Just checking you're there, actually, okay? There's a lot of risks in the book of Ruth. There's an awful lot of risks. And for some of us who are familiar with the story, we sort of just phase past it and we forget that they're there. But the risks in the book are huge. Have you heard of Big History? It's quite big now. If you start looking it up on Kindle and on the internet, Big History is looking at a large story over a short period of time. And in a way, this is the big book of Ruth. We only read the first 18 verses, but I'm going to try and get through the story briefly this morning. The book of Ruth has been described as one of the most moving stories in literature. And the passage we heard this morning, read by Beth, how much sorrow and despair is there in that passage? There's a lot gone on already. There's a story of faithfulness there. There's a story of powerful words. Where you go, I will go. Words that echo through the ages. Really, it's the story of how people who could be enemies, they become more than friends. Question for you. I had loads of questions last time I was here. Do you remember? We did the family fortunes thing. How many times is God mentioned, really, in the book of Ruth? And I'll let you ponder that one. The story opens with these lines. In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine. And Elimelech from Bethlehem and his wife and 2 sons, they went to go to Moab. Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, and then the 2 sons also died. And we have the story of a family in a couple of sentences. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine. There's often a famine, isn't there? If we look on our news and our newspapers, there's often a famine. And when there's a famine, there's a migration. Because people naturally will think, well, there's no food here. If I stay, we are doomed. So some people move. They naturally migrate. They leave their homes, the places they know, the streets they've walked down. They leave the family and the friend support they've got on a risk for something better, with no guarantee at the end. It's a huge risk they undertake to migrate, to look in search of food, in search of jobs, in search of a better life for their children. That's the story of the book of Ruth. Have things changed so much? Have they? Today? Famine. It's not quite famine, but food bank usage has gone up exponentially, hasn't it? There's a food bank here at Risca, isn't there? Hasn't been open that long. I wonder how many people in Risca are now dependent upon food bank. Not a luxury, but a dependency. They estimate there's tens of thousands of people just in the Principality dependent upon the food bank, the net to catch, because they don't have enough food to eat. We forget sometimes the Lazarus at our own gate. It's so bad, really. Tesco's have announced food is so expensive. They're closing stores, haven't they? Because they've now got to compete with Aldi and Lidl, who are always classed as the lower end of the market, because so many people now go there. Famine. And there's the irony, isn't there? Because Bethlehem means place of bread. There's no bread there. So they move to the land of the Moabites. Isn't it always the case that the nearest neighbour is usually the enemy? The old enemy, as the Scots call them sometimes. The French have the Germans, so do the Dutch actually. The English have the French. We have the English, love them, bless them. It's always the next door neighbour, isn't it? The one that, it's the neighbour. God loves us, he blesses us, but why did he put them there so close? Why couldn't they be further away? They go to the land of the enemy. And there's so much already happening in the story. They get to Moab, and Elimelech dies. We don't know much about him. And then the 2 sons, they break with family tradition, and they marry local girls. How many times has that happened? Is it so abnormal, so unusual? But then the sons die, and now we are left with 3 women who are widows. There's no means of support. Their status is gone. There's no widow's pension. There's no social security. It's a compelling story, but it's dark, isn't it? It's like a chapter from Game of Thrones. Elimelech, I think, gets a hard time in the commentaries. Part of the thread against Elimelech, the father who leaves, is, well, he shouldn't have deserted Israel. He should have stayed with the people of God, really. Is he showing unfaithfulness? I get the complaint. I understand where they're coming from. To balance it, though, there's no food. There's no jobs. And moving to a country like Moab, I think it takes a risk, doesn't it? He's taking a risk. It's a gamble. I can't imagine he wants to go there. It's not first on his choices or priorities. But as leader of his family, he feels it's a risk he has to take. After all, it's just a journey, isn't it, to Moab? It's like popping across to Bristol, isn't it? Just hop in and go, like we all came here this morning. It's just a journey. We say, it's just a journey. In the time of sat-nav and centrally planned roads and mobile phones and safe travelling, it's just a journey. But their journey wouldn't have been quite like that, would it? It wouldn't have been quite so safe, so centrally planned, so signposted or sat-naved. I imagine it would have been stressful, wouldn't it? It would have been worrying, going to the unknown. A defining journey. We've just left Advent. Last week was Epiphany, wasn't it? A season when we think of journeys. Lots of journeys in the Advent story. Right the way from Genesis, we seem to be travelling. And so Elimelech takes his family on a journey. He may have been unfaithful. He may have not been loyal to the people of God. But he does take a risk, without which we would not meet Ruth. The loss is too much for Naomi. What did Beth say in the reading? God's hand is against me. She feels that God has done this. She has offended God in some way, so he is smitten all around her. She's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons, and she's lost that station, that status that she held in life. She's a widow woman with no future and 2 daughters-in-law who probably don't look like her. They don't speak the same language, first language. They probably dress differently, they sound differently, different culture, different upbringing, different God. What do they have in common? What is she left with? So she changes her name from Naomi, meaning sweet, to Mara, meaning bitter. It's understandable, isn't it? When life has turned into that chapter, she wants to go back to Bethlehem. She wants to go home, back to the place of no bread. So she tells her daughters-in-law, look, stay in Moab. I'm an old widow woman. You're young. You've got your lives ahead of you. You don't need me as a millstone round your neck. You'll marry again. You'll have children. You can't wait for me to have more children so you can marry them. Go on, live a happy life. Don't stay with this bitter old woman who feels she has no future, who feels that God's hand is against her. There is a tearful goodbye as Orpah leaves. But then from despair in this story we come to hope, don't we? Things start to tip the other way when Ruth says, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Where you die, I will die. And Ruth takes a risk. She takes a risk. She takes a step of faith. The outsider, the person we don't expect in the story, she's a Moabite, the old enemy. She shouldn't be doing this. She should be the one causing the problem, shouldn't she, in the story? She shouldn't be the heroine. What's happening? Ruth takes a step of faith. Sometimes I've heard those words at a wedding, where you go, I will go. And whilst the historical part's not there, the sentiment's correct, isn't it? Where you go, I will go. The loyalty, the faithfulness, the love. And it's not just Ruth's story that turns here, it's ours as well, isn't it? Because later on in the story, they go back to Bethlehem. Ruth meets Boaz, the Redeemer kinsman. And the story ends with hope. Ruth's a compelling story. And we love stories, don't we? Tales of on Kindle Fire if you've got them. How many have got Kindles and Kindle Fire? Loads, I imagine. It was interesting seeing the iPad up there this morning. And there was a click there for books. I didn't see if there was any on there, but I saw the click. We love books, we love stories. And films. What film are you going to see next at the cinema? What film will you see this week? We love stories. We love to feel the attachment. We love the narrative. Is it possible that stories are more popular now than they were then? Some time ago I heard David Day on a video link talk about Ruth, and he watched EastEnders for it. It was a long time ago, the video clip. I don't know how long ago. I saw it in Baptist College. But I wondered if his observations of EastEnders and Ruth were still true. So I made the sacrifice for you all, and I watched some EastEnders clips over the last few weeks. It's enough to push you over the edge, isn't it, with that Christmas storyline? I hadn't watched it in 10 years. I can tell you why I haven't watched it in 10 years. That was hard work. Wasn't much joy there at Christmas. David Day made some observations years ago about EastEnders with the hooks for the storylines. So I tested them to see if they were true. Would you like to hear David Day's hooks? Can you hear my London accent? Can you hear my London accent? I'll do the accent and then I'll do the translation that he gave. So the first one is, which I believe is still in the story, because I heard it once, was, "What's going on? What's going on?" Which means, I need to catch up, because I've missed a few episodes and I've lost the storyline. My favourite one, which I hear sometimes in work, is, "Leave it at. Leave it at." Which apparently means, "Kindly do not scandalise me, or I shall be forced to strike you, my good man." One I heard 3 times was, "He does my head in." The letter H has completely vanished in the estuary area, isn't it? "Does my head in." I'm finding him mostly frustrating, and I also may be forced to strike him as well. And my favourite, which I didn't hear this time, but which David Day had heard, but I didn't hear it, was, "What am I going to do?" Which he said means, "I find myself upon the horns of a paradox," and suggested that it ends with the EastEnders music, dun, 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 dun. But I didn't hear that one. I felt a bit... I couldn't have watched another episode, I'll be honest with you. It was hard going. Have we got any EastEnders fans in? I found it a struggle, in truth. But Day wondered what it would be like if Ruth, Boaz and Naomi were in EastEnders. Would Boaz be the rich owner of the pub and the garage, portrayed as a portly guy, as a diamond geezer with his eye on Ruth? But our Boaz isn't like that. To use a phrase from a friend in work, he's not so much old-fashioned as out of fashion. Because Boaz, in the story of Ruth, leaves wheat at the side of the fields so that Ruth and Naomi have got food. He's years ahead of his time. In a culture where it's dangerous to be a foreigner, especially at time of famine, I would have thought, and a woman, Boaz takes risks. It's easy when there's plenty round, but when there's not food round so much, to leave wheat at the side of the field, I think probably takes a risk. Boaz takes a risk. Very different from the garage gambit that some women go through when getting cars repaired, so I'm told. Boaz is very much out of fashion. He's beyond gentlemanly. He's trying to look after the gentleman kingsman. He does the unexpected thing. He is surprising. I heard that Tony Campolo leaves money at toll booths so that when he goes through, the car behind pulls in and they say that it's paid for you. And there's people left sitting there saying, "What do you mean? It's paid for you." So I've always wanted to do the gag on Mark. I'm going to leave this in the lectern somewhere because he'll be here tonight, won't he? So when he gets up here, if you could mention it. If you could eat it in the sermon, that would be a challenge. But Boaz does something surprising. He looks after someone on the fringe. He's looking after an immigrant. Because Ruth, when she moves back to Bethlehem with Naomi, she's an immigrant, isn't she? Coming back at time of famine, when food is scarce, when jobs are scarce. And Boaz shows generosity. He shows hospitality. Hospitality. Nicola and I have had the privilege of being in a number of warm home groups over the years. Are your home groups going okay? We'll cut that bit from the recording and we'll do it again. I said, are the home groups going okay? Great, because you'll hear it otherwise. One home group we were in which left a mark upon us was the most hospitable home group because of the person whose home it was in. Very intelligent person. Spoke 4 languages fluently that I knew. But it was the food and the warmth and the honesty and the openness of the home that left its mark upon both of us, and I think the others in the group, and it was nearly 10 years ago. And Justine was from Nigeria, and I can still almost taste the food in my mouth. And she taught me a lot about hospitality. Boaz gives us a lesson in hospitality here. He's hospitable in a time of hardship to someone whom many people would not be hospitable to. Nelson Mandela said, "The story of God is a story of how God moves people from hostility to hospitality." That's strong words, isn't it? From a black South African man who suffered under apartheid. Mandela's life was shaped by a place that wasn't very hospitable to him. But he says we should reflect that hospitality of God that God has shown us. Mandela took risks, didn't he? Do you know the story of Archbishop Desmond Tutu? Cropped up recently in Hope Baptist Church in a Bible study. He was walking down the road with his mum, and it was customary at the time that if a white man came onto the road, he had to step out of the way and walk on the mud, on the dust. And as his mum was about to take him off the pavement onto the muddy path, she stopped, because the white man was walking in the middle of the road and had nodded and doffed his cap. And as they walked past, apparently Desmond Tutu looked at him all the way past and said, "Mum, who is this man? What does he do?" And his mum told him what this man did. And Desmond Tutu said, "Mum, when I grow up, I want to be an Anglican minister too." But that minister took a risk. No idea who he is. But that small act left that mark upon that boy, didn't it? A small moment of hospitality, of graciousness, in time of hardship, left its mark. Oh, that we would have the courage for those marks of hospitality in our lives. One of the issues I know we face in Bridgend, and probably here in Risca and in the UK, that's talked about a lot, and in the UK, is the issue of immigration. Careful, Francis, it's politics. There'll be an election coming up, won't there? And I think we know what one of the big themes in the election will be. Some politicians say, we don't have room for immigrants. They should stay in their own country, lest they take jobs from Brits. While others say, well, it's fine for immigrants to come. They help our economy. I lived in Sweden some years ago, technically as an immigrant in a way, a migrant, some years. And I was there at the time of an election. I remember 2 things. One, I remember every migrant I knew, we were the first to know when an election was on. The migrant community was very aware of an election. Sometimes painfully so. The other thing I remember is being talked over by accident. When they realised, they were horrified. But 2 of my Swedish friends talked over me because they forgot I was there. Because I liked skiing and I liked skating and I wore Swedish typed clothes. They forgot where I was from. And they had the same conversation. Well, should we have immigrants in? Well, we're full, but they're good for our economy. And I was in the middle. Then they realised, and there's that awkward, and what do you think? Well, I wasn't there to steal a job. And I wasn't there to help the economy either. I was there because I wanted to be. It wasn't anything complicated, but I was happy. What does God think of immigration as election comes on? Does he think it's because of the economy? Is that the issue? Are immigrants made in the image of God as well, I wonder? It's so easy when it's going to be kicked about in the booths, isn't it? Or on television. Immigration as a political issue. What about immigration from a question of hospitality? What would Jesus do? Used to be the cry. What would Jesus do? Who is it that's the centrepiece in the book of Ruth? It's Ruth, isn't it? And where's Ruth from? Moab. She's from Moab. And who's the one who teaches us about the loyalty and the faithfulness of God? It's Ruth. It's the outsider. It's the one you don't expect. Sometimes it takes someone different to show us what hospitality is. I remember somebody saying a long time ago, being in the kingdom of God is not dependent upon the colour of your passport. Ruth. It's a powerful story. There's a lot of despair at the beginning, but it ends with hope. That verse 18 in chapter 1 that Beth read so well earlier. Naomi stopped trying to change her mind. She realised something had happened. Naomi playing the matchmaker, perhaps. The book of Ruth. There's no miracles in here, is there? God doesn't speak out from a burning bush. The lame don't seem to walk. After Ruth's pledge of faithfulness, the two women go back to Israel. Ruth takes an enormous risk to do that in time of famine. She marries Boaz, and Ruth gives birth to a son who becomes the father of David, who becomes Israel's great king. Ruth, the immigrant, the foreigner, and the house of David, Bethlehem. What did Jesus say? I am the bread of life, the Saviour of the world. And if we go back, we find Ruth in the background. Ruth who took the risks. When was the last time we took some risks? When was the last time we took a step of faith on a journey we were uncertain of? When was the last time we took some risks? Thank you for listening.